it's time. So welcome back. It's time for us to have Cherif to give us his talk.
Yeah, let me prepare myself. So I'll share my screen. Okay. You see the screen?
No?
You see it?
No.
Sure. Okay. Now?
Yeah.
Okay. Good. So this talk will be domain-driven design in software implementation, which is where I will go through the classic patterns of the domain-driven design. So I am Cherif Bouchelaghem. I'm from Algeria. This is my Twitter. This is my GitHub. I work for Bitovi as a consultant on CanJS, which is framework, front-end framework. I'm doing consultancy here in Algeria for backend development and domain-driven design things, mostly for legacy applications. And most of the work that I do is with PHP. And the agenda is about decomposing software with strategic designs, and where I talk about subdomains, bounded context, and ubiquitous language. And the second part will be modeling software using tactical design with aggregates, entities, value object, aggregate roots. And this will be very quick, short and quick. So in the beginning, let's try to define or to know or be in the same page about this domain-driven design, which is the set of patterns that help to or help developers to implement software that deliver high value. So with this, we understand that the objective of the domain-driven design aim to deliver high value behind softwares. That's the objective or the goal. So the first part, which is the strategic design. Strategic design help us to decompose software with subdomains, bounded context, and ubiquitous language. So those 3 or 4 patterns help us to understand the domain that we are working on as a whole. So maybe it is complicated enough. So we need to split it to several parts so we can work on it easily. As Vernon Vaughan said, you really cannot apply tactical design in an effective way unless you begin with strategic design. So strategic designs help us to understand what is the domain that we are working on and how we can tackle it. Sorry. So what are the subdomains? Subdomains is or what is subdomain? It's subpart of your overall business domain. So it is we can think about it as a single part of our domain. So most business domains are usually too large and complex to reason about as a whole. So we generally concern ourselves with subdomains that we must use within single project. So it's a small part in our large domain. This is the subdomain, or what we can say is the problem space. So for example, in an e-commerce system, or which is a classic example in the domain-driven design also, we can find customer management, product catalog, warehouse management, shipping, subdomain, ordering, pricing, or and cart subdomains. Those are the problem spaces or the subdomains that we can have in an e-commerce system. And in the subdomains, subdomains can have several types, like the core domain, supporting domain, and the generic subdomain. So for the core domain, this is where the strategic investment should be. So all the efforts should be in this in the core domain, because, and how we can know the core domain is by asking the why we are making this system. So the answer of this the answer for the why can help us to understand what is really the core domain. So it's where the real value of the system reside, and here where we can put our efforts and put our good programmer or developer or senior for the developer in this part. Supporting domain is the part that we can buy off the shelf or put, for example, not so experienced developer in it. And the generic domain, I don't know why it's erased here. Maybe it's an error. So the generic subdomain is something like the user management, login, logout, and this can be outsourced or even bought off the shelf. Some examples of the core domain in our e-commerce system, like the ordering, the pricing, the cart, or the supporting, like the shipping, product catalog, warehouse management, and the generic subdomain is like the users and role subdomain. So another statement from Vernon Vaughan, which I read several, maybe all of it, his books around domain-driven design. As Matthias say, other books maybe are not really practical. In Vernon Vaughan books, we can find some practical examples. So core domain deserves the best developer resources with a high skill level. So our best developers and all the investment should be in the core domain. And now we can, what is the bounded context? The bounded context is a semantic contextual boundary. This means that within the boundary, each component of the software model has specific meaning and does specific things. Maybe it's not really clear. So bounded context is the solution space. So we have the subdomain, which is the problem space, and we have the bounded context, which is the solution space. So our code, the code will be in the bounded context. And why it is bounded? Because there is what we name the ubiquitous language. The ubiquitous language is where term occur in some context in a system. So for example, the term product or the concept of product could be different from a bounded context like the warehouse and the marketing bounded context. And every concept of product should be bounded inside its context. For example, this is, we can say the ordering bounded context, and we will have just all the specific terms and in our context, and our code will be influenced with the domain language. In the bounded context, we should assign one team by bounded context. This is in the project management stuff, or one team can work on several bounded contexts also, but we cannot assign several bounded contexts to several teams. So every bounded context should have one team, and one team can work on several bounded contexts. And the team will speak the one language, which is this, the ubiquitous language, and this language will be shared between the team members. So we will get a good understanding of the domain. And now we will go to the part of the tactical patterns of the domain-driven design. And let's talk about aggregates. An aggregate is an object composed from entities and value object. Like Matthias said, aggregates, it's really a concept that hard to understand in the beginning, but it is just a big object, or not very big in the principle of designing aggregates. It should be a bit small, not very big for some reasons. It's composed from entities and value object, and we will see what is the entities and value object. An entity model is an individual thing. So the entity is something unique. It has an identity, and this identity will help us to distinguish it from other entities in our domain. It's just an object, or maybe you are not an OOP programmer, could be just a data structure and functional languages, and have life cycle, and they change over time. But in practice, it could be mutable or immutable. It doesn't matter.
Opa, tudo bom, cara?
What?
Ouvindo um meetup aqui. Entendendo nada.
Sorry? Okay, can I continue?
Yeah, you can talk.
Okay. So the value object, or simply a value, is a thing, but it is mutable as a whole, and is one of the concepts that is really hard to understand from the newcomers to the DDD or the domain-driven design. For example, it can be color, an address, a money, which is a famous example in domain-driven design. It is used to quantify or describe something for the entity or the aggregate. So the aggregate root is a specific entity in the aggregate, and is the only member from the aggregate that outside objects can hold reference to. So is like the name say, is the root of our aggregate. So our aggregate, we have several objects, and is the aggregate root is the first object in our aggregate, and can be it's the only object that can be persisted or read from the database. And another concept that is maybe is famous in some kind of architectures, like the event sourcing architecture, but people do not talk about it often, which is the domain events. Domain events is used to describe that something happened in our system or our application. For example, order was placed, or product was shipped, or something else happened in our domain. It's just an object or record to describe a business significant occurrence in a bounded context, of course. And other thing, so I'm really quick because I don't have so much time, and those concepts are already known for most of us, I think. So the domain services, if we have some behavior that we cannot put in a value object or in an entity, so we can use domain service for this to solve this problem. And one of some principles to design domain service is to we can use it to perform significant business process, to transform domain object from one composition to another, or calculate a value requiring input from more than one domain object. So this is where or how we can use the domain services. And another concept or another building blocks of the domain-driven design, which is the repositories, and the repository will work with the persistent system. And why I said persistent, because it makes an abstraction over our storage, which can be a database, a file, or anything else that the domain doesn't care really about, but is really the repository will help us to persist and read our object. So it's like a collection-like object responsible for persisting or retrieving an aggregate from storage location, like a database. So the purpose of the repository is to encapsulate all the logic needed to obtain or persist object references. The domain objects won't have to deal with the infrastructure to get the need references to other objects of the domain. They will just get them from the repository, and the model is gaining its clarity and focus. And some architectures that we can use with the domain-driven design patterns. So we can use the layered architecture, which is the classical one, or the hexagonal architecture, or known by ports and adapters also, the clean architecture, the event-driven architecture, like I said also in the bottom, the event sourcing, but CQRS and with or without event sourcing. But most of people think that CQRS should be or must be used with event sourcing, but they are orthogonal concepts. We can use CQRS out of our event sourcing, and it will really works. There are some of the architectures that we can use with domain-driven design. So your questions are welcome. It was really quick, and I know this is the standards of some basic stuff of the domain-driven design for the launch event. So questions, please?
Thank you, Cherif, for sharing with that.
Sure.
Yes. So my question might be around the bounded context.
Yeah.
So the projects or the demo that you were talking about, we had different contexts, right? And my question, how will someone be able to build different kind of DCs in the application? How are they able to identify them and even classify them into different kind of DCs?
Yeah, it's one of the hardest part, but with the conversation with domain experts. I know this presentation was really quick, but with the discussion with domain experts, or as we saw with Matthias, some practices or some testing practices like the behavior-driven development, or other like maybe event storming as another concept that can help us to know what are the bounded contexts. So we really need some attention in the discussion to detect where a term occurs in what context in the discussion. So if we are talking about the warehouse, and we are talking about product, for example, so we should be careful how and what are the parts of or the characteristics of the product that the warehouse are interested in, and maybe something that related to bounded context that I didn't mention is we should focus on the core domain, not the whole system should be well designed, just the core domain that where I said we should put our efforts there. So strategic supporting domains or generic domains should not be really well designed with value object, entities, etc., etc. So, for example, if our supporting bounded context or supporting our implementation of the supporting subdomain will just work with CRUD with active records. So good is good enough. So good, go for it, and it will just works. I hope I answer your question.
Yeah, that was very able. Someone is asking, that's Nabil, must repositories return just aggregates or no entities? Must repositories return just aggregates?
Yeah, it's so in the ideally should return aggregate. So for consistency, we should return only aggregates, and in one transaction, we should persist only one aggregates. And like this, we can guarantee that we will have some consistency around our objects. But as Matthias said, if this doesn't work for you, so you can use whatever you want. But in the domain-driven design practices, this is what we want to achieve: one repository per aggregates.
So, we spent 1 minute past our time that we scheduled for this talk. But I think if anyone has questions, we can ask all these questions.
Yeah.
So we can do this to all the time 6:25. Then I'll take one. Okay, so someone is also asking about.
I have two other questions. Yeah.
Yeah. What's the best way to choose or say what's AR is crafted of an entity and a value object? My questions are: what's the best way to choose or say it's my AR? That's the aggregate root. So, and what's the difference between aggregates and aggregate root?
So I will start by the second question. The aggregate is the composition of the whole building blocks that we have, and the aggregate is a single unit from the aggregate root is the single unit from our aggregate. So this is the answer for the second part. So this first part, what's the best way to choose or say it's my aggregate root?
Yeah.
And there's no rule of thumb for this to answer this, but testing is always good to make what I read somewhere, which is called the emergent design. So let's start by testing and modeling and experimenting our domain, and everything will be clear to us. So let's just keep iterating over modeling over your problem, and everything will be clear in the future. There is no really rule of thumb to do it.
Awesome. Next one is the queries used by the application service or the UI uses repositories, or is it best to add an order abstraction for this purpose? So using
okay, or it is best to add. So if it's the queries are complicated enough, or reading the data for the UI is complicated enough, we can make a read model or view model, and this is well explained in Matthias' book, the Advanced Architecture for Web Application. Even if it is in PHP, but other languages can benefit from the concepts. I think it works for any language or any platform like .NET or Java. So yes, if the queries for reading data is complicated, we can always have a read model. and repositories for reading, and we have a view model to represent and format the data for the UI. And like this, we can test everything separately, and we are good to go. I hope I answered the question.
Yes.
Okay, any other question?
No, one. No other question.
Okay.
Okay. So thank you, Cherif, and
Thank you, everyone.
appreciate